This is Theophile Obenga. Theophile Obenga is either one of two things: the most underappreciated genius of the 21st century, or the world's biggest fraud. No ifs, buts, or in-betweens. It's really that black and white, and by the end of this video, you'll have made up your mind as to which of the two he is. But first, you ought to know the man. Dr. Theophile Obenga was born west of the river Congo in Brazzaville, capital city of what is now the Republic of Congo. Back in 1936, when Obenga was born, the republic was known as the French Congo. French and not Belgian, because unlike the much greater landmass southwards, French Congo was the plaything of people who lived 5,000 miles away here, Paris. Yet well before the arrival of the troupe coloniale, all of Congo belonged to its native people and was one of Inner Africa's largest ever empires, a principality sweeping from Gabon in the north to Angola in the south. This was the Kingdom of Congo. Centuries later, under the French and in a time and place where the only way to achieve was to abandon your language for that of foreigners, Obenga carved out his own path. He keeps his ancestral tongue, but also adds to his palette the colonialists. Obenga becomes a master of the white man's tongue. He learns French to perfection and proceeds to acquire English. But he doesn't stop there. He swallows up ancient Rome, teaching himself Latin, and in a reversal of Alexander's millennia-old march south, Obenga follows up by seizing control of the tongue of the ancient Greeks. En route to these acquisitions, Obenga defies the odds to become a world-renowned linguist and an Egyptologist too. Reel off his academic credentials and you quickly realize you're dealing with a monster of a mind. Masters in History, University of Paris Sorbonne. Masters in Advanced Studies in History, Linguistics and Egyptology, University of Geneva, Switzerland. Masters in Prehistory, Institut de Paléontologie Humaine, Paris. Masters in Linguistics, Philology and Egyptology, University of Paris, Sorbonne and Collège de France. A PhD from Montpellier University, France, and a member of the French Association of Egyptologists. The list could continue. It would also become redundant. We don't want that. What we want is to ask, why did Obenga so ferociously devour foreign languages and the history of far-flung places like Greece and even Egypt? And why are you likely hearing about him for the first time? Believe it or not, Egypt is in Africa. Unlike his mentor, the notorious Sheikh Anta Diop, Obenga suspected that the history of Africa, as taught by the colonialist, was grossly incomplete. He could look across Africa and see plainly the interconnectivity of African people, their history, cultures, religions, artistic practices, science and literature, along with what he could see from the archaeological record and the reluctant accounts of the very first Egyptologists, men like the Rosetta Stone's decipherer Jean-François Champollion. Obenga concluded that colonialist professors and educators were suppressing the black identity of ancient African peoples like the Egyptians. Why not? After all, they were doing the same thing as far into Africa as, wait for it, Nigeria. There, at the time of Obenga's birth, the predominant narrative of the colonialist was that the Yoruba and Benin civilizations, from their intricate systems of governance to their bronze and ivory relics, were the products of white Atlanteans. If this was what the colonialists were teaching halfway into Africa, then Obenga wondered how far they had manipulated the history of places like Egypt. The old African proverb had to be true then. Until the lion tells his story, the hunter will always be the hero. But if Obenga was a lion, then to tell the true tale of the lion, he had to obtain not just the language, but also the long-hoarded knowledge of the hunters, the French, the British, and Americans. And so Obenga devoured their languages and learning, both modern and ancient. Soon he found himself one of a legion of black scholars making forbidden discoveries about Africa's distant past, things the colonial masters wanted buried in obscure European libraries and jargon-laden papers less legible than hieroglyphs. In 1974, after years wading through these libraries and papers, Obenga and his mentor, Professor Diop, decided it was time to come out with the truth in a very big way. Heads together, they compiled all the relevant findings on the predominant ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians and met with a United Nations organization known as UNESCO in Cairo. This was the famous 1974 Cairo Symposium, set up to answer the question once and for all: who were the ancient Egyptians? The conclusion of the Cairo Symposium was breathtaking. Faced with mountains of evidence from Diop and Obenga that the ancient Egyptian civilization was indeed a black civilization, neo-colonialists and Arab academics concluded that the evidence was inconclusive. Quote, "The overall results will be very differently assessed by the various participants." Close quote. UNESCO were channeling Sherlock Holmes unsuccessfully. But in an unintended admission of their suppression of evidence, UNESCO's closing statement went on to confess that, quote, "Not all participants had prepared for the conference as painstakingly as Professor Diop or his academic ally Theophile Obenga." Close quote. UNESCO went even further and admitted, quote, "It is more than probable that the African strain, black or light, is preponderant in the ancient Egyptian, but in the present state of our knowledge, it is impossible to say more." Close quote. Archaeology didn't matter. Anthropology, no. Historiology and documented accounts, not enough either. Obenga and Diop's efforts at UNESCO were met with indifferent silence. But there was one more field that Obenga maintained was the key, the unexpected silver bullet that shot to pieces UNESCO's artificial unintelligence. Obenga had touched on it in 1974, and after 1974, he really went to work on this one field. His field, linguistics, the science of language. From 1974 onwards, Obenga has been making the most audacious claim in Egyptology since Champollion the Younger claimed to have deciphered the Rosetta Stone. Namely that during the several migrations southwards and westwards throughout the millennia, the ancient Egyptians carried fragments of their language throughout inner Africa, and that as a result, ancient Egyptian is closely related to modern African languages. In a short 2007 paper, Obenga summed up the evidence for this incredible claim in an easy-to-read and accessible document titled Ancient Egyptian and Modern Yoruba. It is a must-read. Obenga goes here to make his point specifically. The deep south of modern-day Nigeria, where you will find the Yoruba nation, an ancient West African people who have always maintained their origins lie in the far east of the continent. Seeking to prove them right, Obenga starts his paper with this high-stakes claim, quote, "If Yoruba and ancient Egyptian pharaonic language show very close sound correspondences between them, it means the two languages are genetically related." Close quote. But Obenga warns, chance similarities between the two languages are not what demonstrate this link. The historical linguist is looking for more than one or two coincidences. There must be a preponderance of pattern. Having duly warned the reader, Obenga lists off a series of basic fundamental words in any world language that the Yorubas possess in their lexicon identical to that of the ancient Egyptian. The following are from Obenga's list, and his list is by no means exhaustive. Bu, place. In Yoruba, Ibu or Ibi. Bu, to detest or abominate. In Yoruba, Bu, to abuse or insult. Mu, water, or Mi, waters. In Yoruba, Omi. Kuku, darkness, and darkness in Yoruba is Okunkun. Bi, bad. Bi, bad. In the Yoruba, Ibi, bad or evil. Ibi. Ir, eye. The Yoruba equivalent, Iri, to see or vision. Iri. Iru, Iru, Iru. This is the ancient Egyptian word for form, nature, or something. In the Yoruba, the equivalent is Iru, Iru, type, aspect, or kind of something. Ru, Ru. This is the Egyptian word for think or to conceive of something. The Yoruba equivalent, Ro, Ro. To imagine or think. Notice anything yet? No? Then listen to this from Obenga. Quote, "It is almost impossible for a language to borrow from another language basic words such as eye, mouth, sun, because they obviously belong to the basic vocabulary filter of any language in the world, and these lexical items help in addition to reconstruct the pre-dialectal common origin." Close quote. In other words, you just can't do it. There is no way this and many other words comprising the fundamental lexicon of a people group can tally with that of another people so far away without there being a link. It's what a statistician might call impossible. There's even more that Obenga's work can show us, because accidentally his thesis might prove something else about the language of the ancient Egyptians that has long been suspected, that it was a tonal language, one in which the meaning of words can change based on the tone or inflection you put on the same sound combinations. A perfect example in Yoruba is the following. Wa could mean come. Wa could mean to be or to exist. Wa means drive. Wa means to search. Did you hear those? All four very different words depended solely on the W, W, and the A, R sound, but their meanings turned on the slight changes in musical note. This was something which Queen Victoria herself remarked upon when she heard Yoruba spoken for the first time, saying it was a quote, soft and melodious language. Quite incredibly, Yoruba and almost every other language south of the Sahara is tonal, a missing feature in the languages of the Middle East and Europe. This might just unlock another aspect of the ancient Egyptian language, how it actually sounded. If the ancient Egyptian language was similarly tonal, it might explain why the same sounds in the Egyptian language can mean drastically different things based on a slight addition or subtraction from their hieroglyphic representation. The Egyptian words for place and detest, bu or bu, are a perfect example, having the same consonant and presumed vowel sounds, but both have different meanings, corresponding exactly to the Yoruba word for place, simply ibu, as in ibugbe, dwelling place, or ibusun, a place of sleep, i.e. bed, and the bu to abuse or insult. Another uncanny example would be the ancient Egyptian word for eye, ir, symbolized by this hieroglyph. It corresponds to the Yoruba word for seeing or vision, iri, and then strangely enough the word for form, aspect or type, irwu, denoted in the hieroglyph with the I and other additions, is virtually unchanged in Yoruba as the word iru or irunkan, as in a type of thing. Coincidence? If coincidence, then you have to explain why these crucial, fundamental words, building blocks of any language, cluster closely with African languages while their equivalents cannot be found in ancient Middle Eastern languages, typically called Semitic. Obenga goes so far as to point this out in his 2007 piece. Just look at the ancient Egyptian word for sun, Ra, and how it clusters with these modern African languages typically, if erroneously, referred to as Bantu. Some of these dialects make no change whatsoever and have maintained the same word Ra for as long as known. Now look across at Akkadian, Hebrew, Ugaritic, Arabic, language groups typically referred to as Semitic. There is no correspondence whatsoever. Or the Egyptian word for mouth, Ru or Ra or Ro, in comparison with its African equivalents relating to the mouth or to speech, Ro, Aru, Lo, Lu. Again, almost identical. Compare that with the Akkadian word pu. Taken in combination with many other anthropological, cultural, religious and genomic markers, it is almost undeniable that during their many migrations southwards, the Egyptians colonized and settled throughout what is commonly referred to as sub-Saharan Africa. Kamjiverse, a notable layman authority and enthusiast of Egyptian history, claimed this in a recent video.
According to Dr. Musa Lam's documentation in the African Union Factbook, following the Persian invasion of Northeast Africa, many ancient Kemites migrated west and Central Africa. These migrations were driven by factors such as oppression from foreign invaders and a desire to escape their rule. These ancient Kemites' descendants would later become victims of the Ma'afa, the transatlantic slave trade, and be trafficked to the Americas. Historical records indicate that with each invasion of ancient Kemet by foreigners, a significant portion of its indigenous black population sought refuge by emigrating to other regions of Africa, particularly south or west of Kemet. This pattern of migration occurred repeatedly, with scholars identifying as many as 6 major migrations westward across the Sahara Desert alone. Professor Abubakar Musa Lom, from the Faculty of History and Human Sciences at the University of Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, has shed light on these migrations. He has highlighted the work of Yoro Diao, a historian from the late 19th century, who compiled Western Sudanic oral traditions regarding migrations from the Nile Valley. These traditions, spanning from the 7th century BC to the 6th century AD, corroborate the existence of 6 major migrations from the Nile Valley toward the west, across the Sahara Desert. Each of these migrations, as described by Diop, was prompted by external invasions of the Nile Valley or by the oppressive regimes established by foreign rulers. These movements of people not only shaped the demographic.
If this migration theory is correct, then one can expect anthropological traces in a way you wouldn't expect archaeological traces across the vast, inhospitable expanse of the Sahara Desert, and the anthropological traces are almost unending. The Yorubas throughout their ancient art represent their kings as wielding 2 signs of authority, a hooked, sometimes beaded scepter and a flail typically made out of a horse's tail. Millennia prior, the Egyptians would have instantly recognized this symbol in a way others outside the continent wouldn't. Again and again, their pharaohs donned the shepherd's crook as a sign of authority and a flail, originally a cattle animal's tail, on the end of a scepter. Then there was the grim and thankfully only briefly practiced tradition of burying alive royal slaves with the deceased pharaoh. This same practice was the subject of the famous play by Africa's first ever Nobel laureate, Wole Soyinka. In Death and the King's Horseman, the king's trepidatious horseman is to be ritually killed and buried with the recently deceased monarch, as per ancient Yoruba tradition. There are many more anthropological and religious crossovers between the Yorubas and the ancient Egyptians. Experts can no longer ignore them, and more have started to pay them due attention. Egyptologists like Dr. Abdul Salau of Tuskegee University and Dr. Salian Ashton are just a couple among many. But Obenga was one of the first to start sounding the alarm about all of this. So what do you think? Was he right? Or was he just another fame-hungry, money-grubbing Afrocentrist? If the latter, then he performed pretty poorly. He isn't popularly known today, and a retired professor about to enter his 90s, he is no Jeff Bezos. But the debate he started is raging. So join in, leave your polite, respectful opinions below in the comment section, subscribe for more exposés on fascinating black history, and support the True Black effort to bring hidden black history to the world. From Kush to Compton, no doubt.
onígẹ̀lẹ̀ yìí.